Where's Chairman Hunter?
He's across the street from me.
Oh, wait, don't wake him up.
Wake 'em up.
Oh, there he is.
Oh,
We need to unmute him.
Steve, unmute. Bottom left.
There you are.
There you go.
Okay. Greetings, everybody. Who am I missing here? Hi, Ed. Hi, Dwight.
How are you?
And hi, Jennifer. And thank you.
Yeah, right.
And Laura Lee, thank you for joining us.
We don't have Alan.
Alan Hale.
Huh? Is that George Palmer on vacation?
Not yet. Getting close, though.
Okay. Well, it's 8 o'clock and I think we can start.
Yes,
Thank
Chairman, you
all
can start.
for joining us tonight. I don't think any of us want to drag this out, so we should maybe agree that we're going to do an hour, maybe a little bit over, depending on how we're going. But this is probably not the last go at this, so I think we ought to see where we go and how we feel in an hour, and then make a decision.
Okay.
Good. Dwight, what do you think's the best way to approach this?
He's muted.
Dwight, put your,
Wait, you have to unmute.
there you go, I think.
I'm on now, I think, right?
Yep.
I missed the last meeting, so I'm not sure what progress was made on it, but I had a couple
Well,
of.
I think you can assume none.
Okay.
No, actually, I think we've made some progress.
Yeah,
Okay,
I could
Steve and Alan did the work.
I could go through our former presentation sort of,
that's a good idea.
and I could get to the spot where we've made some developments, and Rob Lane could explain those.
Let's do that.
Okay. Everybody ready? I'll grab the screen.
Sure.
All right. So can you see it? See it?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Let me try it again.
You don't have the charts memorized, Steve?
How about now?
Yep, we see it now.
You're seeing your screen. There it comes.
Oh.
Okay, so this is just lightly updated since our last meeting. This is the MDR2 zone. It's sort of like a shillelagh shape. This is with the buildings on it. And I think everybody's seen that except for maybe Dwight. This is what it looked like in 1889, just for the heck of it. It hasn't changed a lot, so it's definitely got a historic character, which I think is mentioned in the vision plan as something that is valuable. I did these from Google Earth, or from the Google mapping. It's lovely how Dobbs Ferry has been 3D scanned, so you can actually see the relative size of the buildings. And I have a little closer views here, so you can see there's some large ones, some small ones. There's not a huge difference, it's sort of a grab bag of site coverage. Here's some of the larger buildings. I think the most of any of these buildings is occupied is maybe 8 units or 10 units, and a lot of them are just single family houses. There's some more. Now we're coming to the part where this is the work that Rob Lane did in between this meeting and last meeting. And Rob, you might want to explain what this is, and then I'll go to your chart, your map.
Well, let me clarify number one by saying that this isn't my work. It's work I commissioned from someone younger and smarter and more competent at using GIS than I, who used the GIS files from Westchester County, which include the building footprints, as well as the tax lots and all the tax lot numbers. And what he did through some trickery, which I can't explain, is he actually figured out, I mean, I can explain it conceptually, I just couldn't do it myself. I asked him to figure out what the coverage was, both for the overall district and for each of 3 sub areas. And basically what he did was, in code, he figured out a trick to basically have his computer figure out the area of the building footprints, and then with that, compare that to the area in the tax lot records and come up with a coverage number. So I just want to be clear, it's not my work. I mean, I'm not apologizing for it. I just don't deserve credit for it. I didn't do more than really ask him. The extent of my effort was to ask him to do this exercise, which he did. And then I think, Steve, you have the two images.
That's called management, Rob.
Well, or the privilege of old age. So basically I broke it down into 3 sub areas because it seemed like the area up on the terrace there, area B, is kind of fundamentally different than the area that we're most concerned with is A. And then of course there's area C. And so those percentages that you see there are the coverage numbers for each of the 3 sub areas. The one that we're most concerned with, of course, is sub area A. That's the most immediate one. And the 0.29 number is the coverage for the district overall. The red parcels that you see there are ones that he accepted from the calculation. One is the church. The other is whatever number brought God, I can't remember.
75 Main.
Yeah. You think that do you think that I'd wake up in a cold sweat with those numbers based on what we've been through, but I don't remember them. And then this is the Embassy Center over here. So it doesn't include those 3, but it includes all the others that you see outlined here. So it's just a good benchmark to the extent that we're wrestling with this coverage issue.
Now, I mean, I don't know. I can go through the rest of the show if you want. I mean, you've seen it. Essentially what happens in the rest of this show is I walked around on the street and I took pictures of street level views. And then I also included all the village codes that we talked about in the last meeting. So does anybody want to go into that? And do you remember that, or would that be useful?
Just as a quick refresher, why don't you just gun through that?
Okay.
Just go through it quickly.
Okay, so this is the existing table B2 about the measurements for MDR2, minimum lot area, dwelling unit area, maximum lot coverage. So 27% building coverage, 54% lot coverage. And that, what was your chart? Your chart was 29%, Rob, or 20? Oh, your mic is turned
Go
on.
back, I don't remember, but it was right in that world. Go back one slide. Overall, 29 and sub area A, 28. It's like almost spot on.
So it's like,
Rob, that's an average number?
Yes, that's an average of the coverages for the buildings in each of the 3 zones.
Okay, but that would sort of imply that 50% of the properties are non-conforming, right?
well, this is only the coverage.
This is just coverage, and that's pretty close, right?
It's not setbacks or anything like that.
Right.
There's a lot of non-conforming setbacks. So, hey, Alan, were you able to see, did you come in and you were able to see the earlier part of the presentation? Did you miss anything?
No, I didn't miss anything. I've been watching.
Okay, good. So this is our existing dimensional standards. This is lot coverage dimensions, and the percentage of as lots get bigger, what happens above 7,500 square feet. And it's interesting. I mean, one of the arguments of the applicant was that he had a bigger lot, so he should have a bigger percentage, but a percentage is automatically bigger if it's a bigger lot. I mean, that's what a percentage is. So that I didn't see the argument in that. This is what's allowed in terms of parking. Depending on what's done there, if he wants to do a 2 or 3 family, he needs a couple of spaces per dwelling unit. Multifamily, 1 space, and then a quarter of a space for every other bedroom. Sort of the types of buildings that are allowable in an MDR2 zone. This is the view shed, which I don't think this at least for 156 Palisades, I don't think it unless it gets really tall, it's not it won't obstruct a viewing platform. These are eye level views, and I'll just cruise through these because you just get a sense of the scale of the buildings. That's the Embassy Center in the center. This is Hudson Terrace, where the buildings are bigger and they're sort of closer together on the lot, but they have a similarity, which is really nice.
Yeah.
Memorial Park, Church, 75 Main. Now these are looking at the east side of Palisades, just sort of walking up the street. Single family houses, some of them are quite small with a lot of space on the lot, and some fill up the lot. But it has a certain crazy consistency.
Mhm.
Some rear buildings. This is a building that was recently worked on by Gotham Design, which I think is a pretty nice job.
Yeah.
This is we're getting up towards, this is taken from the driveway for
The
yeah.
45.
Yeah. And looking up towards Cedar Street. Here's another, just looking back into some back building with people parking the driveways. This is standing almost at Cedar Street looking south. So you get a sort of a scale, a sense of the scale and the rhythm. A couple of bigger buildings in there. That's the west side of Palisades. Crazy combination of like a little single family house and an apartment building. Now this is this suburban house set back from the street. That's it. So I can go back to any of the slides if anyone wants to go to them, or.
So I just have one question just for the group, right? Because there are 2 issues, right? The application for the project and the larger issue about what to do about this zone overall. So how are we organizing our discussion?
Well,
I mean,
shouldn't this be about the zone overall? And I mean, the applicant should be fitting a project into the zone overall.
I
right?
agree.
I mean,
I agree. But
we have already
referred. Yeah, I agree. And we have already referred to the applicant. I would just offer, I agree with Peter, I think we should talk about the zone overall, but I do want to offer just one thought about the project, which is there some reason why, like maybe one of the things to ask for is to, and maybe have I missed this? Maybe they've done it already. What does an as of right solution look like on this site? Like if you wanted to, I know he did diagrams, or a series of diagrams that just showed this coverage issue and what the implications were on a hypothetical lot. But suppose you actually had to develop a building there with no variances, what would it look like? And I feel like that actually, that test on various sites along the way would be the way to get at our critique of the zone overall. Like he has one site, but in a way, it would be interesting to take 3 or 4 different sites that are either different sizes or in different places and see, okay, if you absolutely followed the letter of the law and you weren't going to ask for a single variance for yards or anything else, what would you butt up against? Can you literally not build something on some of those lots, or does it just have to be a smaller building and you have to live with that? And then you get into the discussion about, well, okay, so then maybe there's a variance for this or variance for that. But we haven't actually seen what the as of right solution looks like for this site, right?
That's right, we haven't yet.
I think he did a footprint of what as of right would have been. But I just want to say, looking at your hard work and the averages in the 3 different areas that you did, one thing I notice is that, and well, let me go back and say, we all sort of thought that there was enough feeling that this zone wasn't quite right to look at it and to look at changes. So, and in Han's old report, he did come up with the idea that this is supposed to be a more dense zone than the MDR1, more densely populated, so most likely logically should be more densely dense in building coverage. But I don't believe what the applicant proposed is the proper density. But going back to your 3-section map, one thing I noticed is that the area B, I think it was, was 35. And if we look at the area A where the proposed project is in, the west side of the street has some pretty abnormal lots, yeah. So C, you're 28, B, you're 35, and that was the elevated ones. But A looks a lot, the east side of A looks a lot closer, more heavier coverage than the west side, because the west side, you have those very long lots that are going down towards 145 Palisades Street. I'm just thinking averaging that side into the west side and into the east side sort of skews the average down a little bit. So if we were to remove that, I would guess that the average for A on the east side would be more like 32 or something like that.
I can get that, by the way. I can easily, I think you're probably right. I like what you're doing, but I'll figure out what it actually is. I can easily.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of where we got to shoot for. That was, I think there was a few people, myself, I thought you and Steve were on the same track in the beginning of this whole process, that we were looking at like 32, something like that. And I think your work here, if we were to take out that west side, would prove that. So I'd just like to see that number.
Well, I'd like to look at this from a different direction. I think what would the number be if we had 80%, if we had 80% of the properties conform to a number? or 75%, some number like that, where, you know, we're getting a number that's based on what the current development is. And I'd like to think that's going to look more, that's going to be a guidance towards something that's going to fit with the existing neighborhood more than just than the average. I don't know that the average really does much for us.
Well, you'd like to see what the 75 percentile coverage is.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I know Dwight harps on this all the time, that we want as few non-conforming properties as possible. And also, I think that's going to be more representative of, you know, what's gonna fit and not stand out hugely as being overly large, and still give us our maximum density, which we think is a target for, you know, because this is supposed to be downtown, mass transit, all that stuff. So it fits a lot of, you know, checks a lot of boxes, I guess is the right way to put it.
So then, Rob, I think if he's already got the numbers, the high numbers and the low numbers and the average, he could get 75% too, right?
You're muted, Rob.
I always mute myself when I agree. I find that it works better.
I was wanting to step back for a minute on the whole thing. And what troubled us about the application that Patty put in was that it was out of scale in relation to the buildings on the east side, that particularly interesting block of buildings. I think it's kind of a choppy zone, but we do have to keep an eye on that one block. What makes it so special? What makes it so interesting? And I was thinking, well, obviously the buildings are set up right up near to the sidewalk. There's not the front yard setback, and there's been some discussion of that. It certainly would be inappropriate to have him comply with the zone for this building and put it to 20 feet back. That would just be, I can't see any advantage of that. So that piece of it. The other way to look at it is that when we start talking about form-based zoning, I thought we were breaking away a little bit from standard land use zone stuff, and start with what is special about that block and why we're so concerned that that building that's been proposed doesn't really work. And so what are the characteristics of that? Well, their buildings are close to the street. They're small. They're fairly narrow lots. There's a lot of them that don't have driveways into the building. There are some driveways, obviously, but very few actually have parking under the buildings. And that was part of the proposal they put in. So what makes it special? And I think you go back to basic principles of what is good design? What makes a building fit into a neighborhood? What is the character of the neighborhood? What are we, to me, it struck that one block where we are, that is very much worth preserving. And it's different. There's different ways each of the facades is treated. And the rest of the MDR zone, well, I did like the buildings up above that wall, but by and large, they're their own discrete thing. The rest of it is a bit of a hodgepodge as far as I could see, but that one block on the east side. So starting to look at it through zoning might be, the zoning is kind of a, what is it? It's a bit of a meat cleaver kind of thing in terms of dealing with design. And we should look at this from a design standpoint, from a historic standpoint, from what would enhance that block, add to it, not subtract from it. And I came up with a really crazy idea. I wondered, it's not what we would normally approve, but I think there's special characteristics of this site. I wondered if it should be subdivided into 2 lots, probably neither of which would conform to zoning, but would then perhaps accommodate 2 buildings, maybe 2 3-family buildings that would mirror the scale of the rest of the block. And so that I just wanted to, for a moment, step away from zoning, which is a heavy duty tool. You need it, but you don't want to be hamstrung by it in all cases, especially where you have a kind of unique block. So that's, and I would worry that we did, and anything I suggested to be done with it, such as cutting the building by 25%, some of the stuff that Patty's done, it didn't solve it to me. It still was too big, still out of step. And then to create a conforming building that would sit with, on a much wider lot, I'm not so sure that does the trick either. So just for the heck of it, I wondered, wouldn't it be worth looking at subdividing the lot in two. They would be substandard. We don't like to do that. But I think design and fitting into that block should take precedence over anything else. That would be my feeling on it.
That sort of resonates with me. And you pointed out something really important, that there aren't any on the east side of Palisades. There aren't any, and I don't think on the west side either, any basement garages that you drive into. All the facades are pretty present close to the street or a little bit set back, but it's all that human scale. It's not, you're not looking at a garage, you're looking at somebody's front porch, basically.
Yeah. And the treatment of the facades over the years, there's a wide, they're so sort of unique, but they fit together somehow. It's kind of like, but as Steve was saying, the garage under does not fit well. There might be one right up at the corner, but otherwise I don't think I think you're right that they don't have
All
that.
right.
So
Yeah, the carriage house. Yeah, the one at the corner of Cedar was I think they had the carriage in there.
mhm.
Wow.
Just to say the setback that you mentioned before, Dwight, is not an issue for this project because I think he was as a right when you calculate the prevailing. He gets the prevailing calculation. As you could see, all of those houses are all built close to the street.
Right.
So he doesn't have to go back 20 feet. So
I like the prevailing. I think that's a very, your codes have some really, the vision plan's a wonderful document, and then the codes have some wonderful pieces in it, one of which is that not all communities have the prevailing, the use of prevailing as setting the front yard setback. And I think it's been wise that you have it. I think there's other characteristics of your zoning. You have, the planning board has a lot of flexibility. They don't have to go to the zoning board for most things. As far as I recall, they can waive certain things if they look at it. And so and that power also goes to the Board of Trustees when it's an action before them. So there's this ability to take into account more than just what the zone says, and more than just saying, well, you got to go to the ZBA. And oftentimes you can't get the rationale for the ZBA to grant certain things is very, very restricted. And yet I think sometimes we just have to bend and make those approvals. But really the waiver provisions that the planning board has are very useful tools, so long as we don't set some precedents that'll come back to haunt us. But if you do a careful study like this block and say, maybe it would be worth it to have the lot subdivided to get two smaller properties on it, maybe that rationale would hold up pretty well because of what the vision plan says about this area and because of the uniqueness of the block in its own right. So that's my thought on it at the moment. And
I think that's something you could suggest to the applicant when we're back at the planning board, so the applicant would have to want to subdivide. But right now we're looking at what is the appropriate coverage and setback for this zone. And so we're looking at a zoning chart change. And
it feels to me like it's going to be fairly minor. Now that's not unimportant, but if we go from 27 to 32, we should do that. Is there anything else that we have to do? Some of the height stuff gets tricky a little bit in the zone, but we haven't really studied that, I don't think. Yeah, well, let's make that change. I mean, that's.
Are we happy with the current setback numbers?
From the side yards and beyond the front yard setback.
Well, yeah, front, side, yeah. I mean, the whole thing. I haven't really looked at that in detail.
Here, I'll call them up.
Side yards are 10, and I don't think there's a lot of, we'd have to check that.
There's only a couple that would fit.
Yeah.
So that should be, or, again, you can have flexibility on it a bit where you don't want to use the same tool of what the actual setbacks are to be able to waive those things. But there, some of that, Ed, and congratulations to be acting city manager or village manager. Is it village administrator or village manager?
Village administrator.
Okay.
I
Congratulations.
serve at the behest of the board. The manager runs the show.
Okay.
Administrator just works for the board.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay. So look at the side yard. Ed, isn't, the building codes come into this a bit. Isn't there at least 6, is it 6 feet?
Well, we need at least 5 feet for, fire code
Okay.
anywhere. And nowhere does the setback go down to 5 feet, except in, the downtown zones, where
Mhm.
downtown transition is 5 feet. The downtown business, which is a problem for me, is 0.
Mhm.
And
Right.
I always thought it should be changed to 5 to mimic the downtown transition to meet with fire code. Because if you're at 0 lot line, you can't have opening windows.
Right.
So,
But you can
But-
have in a street wall of buildings, and there's a lot of downtowns that have that. And it isn't it the
Yes.
answer that then they, you require sprinklers and other ways to.
yes, you can definitely do that.
I think,
But nowhere else, I've said, in any of the, residential districts, as you can see on the chart, do we fall below 10 at a side yard.
I think, well, first of all, I think it's good that Dwight is in the witness protection program there. Got himself lit, like, we don't know where he is. We're not sure it's Dwight. Good. He's gonna need that. But I think, the issue of kind of the issue about where does zoning begin and design review, where does kind of zoning and planning board review end, and where does AHRB and design review begin, is sits at the crux of this whole thing. And unfortunately, we just haven't, theoretically, it should work exactly as Dwight is describing. You'd have to have a set of design guidelines, in order for it to not be sort of arbitrary and capricious. You'd have to adopt a set of design guidelines that laid out as, it's not necessarily quantitative, but typical design guidelines would be a booklet where you'd photograph the buildings on the street, the ones we've used to photograph Steve Bosnan has already taken. You'd annotate them and try to explain as much as possible to the next person who applied, here are the things that we all agree in town make this a special street. And so your building should have these features and characteristics. Unfortunately, that document doesn't exist at the moment. Doesn't mean we shouldn't create it. We probably should, there are other places in the downtown where we should probably create design guidelines, as you pointed out, Dwight, with the aqueduct in particular. But I feel like the history, now having been on the board for however long it's been, 10 years or whatever, the history of the approvals process, and maybe it's because I'm thinking of the ones where the Board of Trustees was also involved, adding yet another layer of craziness. But so now this is just going to be the planning board and the AHRB, so maybe it'll be more rational, but we just haven't had a lot of good history, I feel like, with doing what you're describing, which is there ought to be a way. You can write all the code you want in the world, but in the end, you're not going to get the right building. That's your point, and that's right. You can't zone for appropriate contextual infill. You need another layer of design guidelines and discretionary review. And we just haven't had a good history with that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I think probably you have to do it in a place like Dobbs Ferry, but it's not, it hasn't been great so far. And
But doesn't that really argue for a restrictive code? Because the planning board has the ability to waive different restraints if they get a good building. I think the problem with a lot of the projects, they don't come in as a project. They come in as a concept, and they get feedback here and feedback there, and then a building gets created out of the feedback, as opposed to a building that's created by thinking of what's appropriate for the site. And I think you just have to say, that projects that come to the planning board should be attractive projects. And if they need a tweak here or a tweak there because of the zoning code, show us where this project is worthy of those tweaks. And
But Peter, we've tried that. I mean, that's essentially what does happen. You know, when somebody comes before us and they present something, we turn to Ed, who's the only one who really knows the code. We critique it from exactly the point of view you're saying. And then we turn to Ed and we say, hey, Ed, is that right or not right? And he tells us whether we're in line or not. We don't open up the code as we're reviewing the projects and check off all of the, I mean, the applicant is required on their cover sheet to have a table where they say where they're asking for things that are not conforming. But we essentially do that, but we often don't agree with ourselves and then among ourselves. And then we know that the AHRB is going to weigh in on these aesthetic things. And sometimes they have very different ideas. So the mechanism that we need to have as bodies, as reviewing bodies, to reconcile and consolidate all that stuff, we just haven't been. I mean, maybe it's just as bad in every other town. I don't know, but I feel like we haven't been that.
Sure it is.
Huh?
I'm sure it is.
I don't know.
But
But I feel at the very least, I like what Dwight is saying, the spirit of what he's saying, but then we'd have to produce, and an applicant would be entitled to a set of design guidelines where we've at least tried to where we're not just going like this and saying we like it or we don't. I think we'll get in trouble if we try to do that, but to try to lay out as best we can, well, what is it about this? Is it the porches? Is it the setbacks? Is it something about the materials? You know,
I think we could do that. We could walk down the street and, I mean, I think that Dwight started it with, there's, the cars are not driving in the bottom of the building, and you're not facing a garage in most cases. So, I think we could make some,
we could annotate
12 bullet points and say, how about,
But at some point,
I think you could, but isn't that the applicant's job to show you that this building conforms to the neighborhood? I mean, the neighborhood is very important to us on the zoning board, in that we don't grant variances willy-nilly. We kind of look and see what everyone else has, and is this accidental, because of where the structure was built? Does everyone else really have this? And, we'd be disadvantaging this neighbor or, the applicant because he doesn't have it and the neighbors all do because of some quirk in the code. And, we try to be equitable that way. And in the same vein, this applicant, or any applicant should be looking at the buildings to the right and left and across the street and showing you that it fits in, and I'm not sure that try to codify that for an applicant really makes sense.
Well, isn't there already an excessively dissimilar issue in the code?
Yes.
And where does that fit into this discussion?
In the AHRB powers. So to Peter's point, if most of the applicants did that, we wouldn't need this board. So you just come in to the building department and we say, okay, it's this big, it's that big, okay, build it. But they don't. What they do is they design a box that they get as much square footage of floor space to rent or sell as they can get. And then it's up to the planning board and the AHRB to bring it down to something that fits into the neighborhood.
I mean, we've never said, somebody brings in a design and we say, this thing stinks, bring something else. I think we have to give them some guidance,
So writing design guidelines is a good idea. I mean, we have design guidelines in a generic sense for the downtown districts and for the residential districts, but nothing really specific for the residential zones.
I can show you, first of all, I mean, just to Peter's point, there's case law here. And because discretionary review is often challenged in court as being arbitrary and capricious. And the thing that people defend themselves with is a set of design guidelines. They say it doesn't pretend to codify it to a point where it's going to make it beautiful or not. But you have to show that it's more than just the five of us or us plus the HRB saying we like it or we don't, or we think it fits or it doesn't, because people can reasonably disagree. Now, what I have seen, and I can send, and maybe what I'll do is I'll circulate some examples because I've collected some of this stuff over the years. You can do a pretty basic set of design guidelines. And this is often done by taking photographs of the buildings that you think conform and just annotating them, just like literally writing on them, porch, you know, windows of a certain rhythm or whatever, and doing that on a bunch of images. You don't have to do necessarily a whole bunch of detailed dimension drawings and so on. You can have what are called character guidelines. And it's still going to be a discretionary review, but you've protected yourself somewhat against just being arbitrary and capricious, because you can, because when the applicant says, well, I think this does fit, you can say, well, it doesn't really, because you have this garage thing going on the ground floor. And we've shown you that 9 out of 10 buildings on this street don't have that. So I don't think it would be a super high lift necessarily to create a set of design guidelines that would, and that would probably, by the way, be a relief not only to the applicant, but to us, because, and to the AHRB, because it would frame the discussion and it would become more than just, well, I like it and I don't like it.
So Rob,
Ayer, do you have a,
I'm sorry.
Ayer?
You're muted.
So I have
Bottom
a,
left.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
go ahead.
So I agree with everybody, more or less what everybody's saying. What I wouldn't call it design guidelines, I would call recognizing the patterns of the street. And if we recognize like a few elements that are defines the character of that side of the street. I don't know. I circulated a quick sketches that tries to understand what are the forces that shape the Palisades east, west, the relationship of Cedar or Main Street, sorry, Main Street, even Cedar, Main Street east and west, which are very different in character, and maybe Main Street west is a long block, the other one is broken. There's a difference in scales, and then you have the aqueduct, etc., etc., etc. So all I'm trying to say that each block or each section, even what Rob says, the A section is very different from the east side to the west side, and could be, you know, I agree that the percentages or the load coverages needs to be analyzed on one end of the block because it's very different from the other. And also the prevailing setbacks, the front setbacks, sorry, should we also measure if possible and analyze further. We will get some data that is useful to understand how we'll fit a proposal into the book that eventually is contextual. And I'm totally for the, I don't know if to call it design guidelines, but clarifying that the patterns that exist on any street, you know, that's worth considering and respecting it, because we all agree that, and we are sitting here because we all agree that Palisades has some character that to be understood and respected and codified somehow for future review. And that's basically it. I think it's totally worth the exercise.
Maura, did you have something?
Well, I was just wondering, a little comment. The whole parking thing, and maybe I understood it, but I think that a parking, like if you can put the parking for whatever development you're making aesthetically pleasing, then I think it should be allowed rather than not having a building that conforms to whatever we're thinking about and then not allow the parking. So what I was hearing, and maybe I'm wrong, is that we were considering not having a parking garage in a sense, but if it's aesthetically pleasing to be allowed that, then why wouldn't we allow that to be in the project?
No, I
Just
think I think you're right, but I was envisioning when Dwight was describing two lots, a driveway in between and the parking lot behind the buildings. And
Right.
There's plenty of space back there.
So as long as they could provide parking for the building, that would be awesome, because in my opinion, I don't think over the years, there will be enough parking for people, like we now allow like one car per bedroom or whatever, or at least that's what the applicants are asking for. So we know, or at least I know in my building, we have 2 or 3 cars in one apartment. So that means that there's more cars going to be on the street, and therefore we already have a parking problem. So why wouldn't we accommodate any proactive action to have a design that allows parking? That's all I'm wondering.
Yeah, as long as we are respectful to the character of the street, and as long as we are within the patterns that gives the quality that we desire.
And the other thing that I noticed when I was
challenged.
So I've actually walked my dogs a lot of times now down Palisade, which I didn't do in the past. And I also feel like the setback should at least be at least 10 feet, you know, because I mean, I know it's a 20-foot in the code right now, but when you're walking down the street and you see the way the houses are proportionally to the neighborhood, I think like it's nice to have that at least a 10-foot setback. And that's just a personal thing. Just wanted to put that out there.
Laura Lee, have you seen situations where there are guidelines but not just kind of not enforceable so much, but in terms of design guidelines? I mean.
Well, I mean, I've seen, as Mr. Rosenkrantz said, I've seen those guidelines under the auspices of the Architectural Review Board, but I've never seen them at the planning board level. That being said, it's certainly a valid criteria to look at the similarity and the character of the neighborhood. And you can tell right away if something, as you have said, is out of scope, out of size, out of style. That's really not a subjective view. That's something that's quite apparent right out of the box. But clearly you have a lot of non-conforming properties right now. So looking at the zone as a whole has to help the process at this point, because you just don't know what to expect, because as Mr. Manley has suggested, of course the developer's coming in and trying to look at what they can do to maximize their investment. So, you know, you have to be comfortable with that it fits in the scope, fits in the character, and having something to point to, as Mr. Lane has mentioned, is an important part of making your decision viable and also defensible. So yeah, it's not a usual process, but I think as long as you don't call it a design guideline and you truly annotate the character and provide that as something that you should follow, I think you're in good standing.
Great.
Interesting.
Like I said, I wouldn't call them design guidelines, I'd call them character guidelines, and I'll circulate some examples of some of the things that I'm thinking of, and that some of the, and you all can see it, and then we can to see if that's something we want to do. I don't think the bar is that high.
I'd be happy to send a link to all the photos if you want to use those for reference.
We can walk Palisades together at some point and try to recognize patterns that can be integrated into the guidelines.
Can the vision plan be used for that, or do you need something in addition, or can it be built into the vision plan, or does it need to be something entirely separate?
I was looking at the vision plan because it's in the memo from February of 2016. And, you know, it refers to Old Town. And the only thing it says is the primary purpose of the MDR district is to maintain the character and scale of established neighborhoods characterized by a mixture of detached one-family houses, 2- and 3-family homes, and multifamily housing often found in large older buildings.
But yes, Donna, the vision plan would be the proper home for that, in my opinion. And a new comprehensive plan that the village is talking about should include those if we do that.
Yeah, I like the village plan as it, the vision plan as it exists. And I think it almost leads toward this, the way we analyze neighborhoods when whoever did that work on the vision plan, which I think highly of, was very specific to certain neighborhoods, described some of the character. Not all master plans work the way that this vision plan does. And I think that's the logical thing, is to take that. And then, for instance, if we kept it narrow, we've got the photos that have already been done by Steve, there's been some work done and stuff like this. It might not be that big a deal to actually pull some of those characteristics together as part of an overall assessment of the strengths and qualities of the town, and the desire to the extent feasible, to retain these, or to, when things are built into it, to enhance. So Rob's point about being in a defensive position from lawsuits is absolutely very valid, and having some guidelines at a certain level, which is for this neighborhood that we're looking at, is we might not even have design guidelines for the entire MDR2 zone. We may just pull out one section of it, if that doesn't get us into trouble also, and say there's a special cluster of buildings that need to be looked at every time a project comes in to do anything to them or build next to them. And we've now looked at what are those characteristics, and we would think that any new project would try to address those. Something like that, I think, could be done without being overly burdensome.
So what are our next steps?
I was gonna say, can we make subgroups like Rob did with A, B, and C? Can we do a zone with subgroups or not?
Sure.
And overlays?
I don't know what you call it, but if A is dissimilar to B and C, would it make sense to somehow segregate them if we have an MDR2A and MDR2B?
Donna, I think that there is a prevailing concept, and there is already the discretionary review. We can do a base, and we identify the patterns or the guidelines. So, and then everybody can see if the proposal fits or it doesn't. It's, you know, I guess we are all in agreement that the proposal brought by Patty is just too big. It's all
Right.
Right. I think this is another discussion and another project, you know, getting into guidelines and design. But I think we need to quantify the zoning table first, this part, because that project may take a whole lot longer.
We already have the front yard setback discretion. And we're talking about the side yards not all being 10 feet, maybe 5 feet, if that's what is prevailing out there, either by amending the zoning ordinance to say in this MDR2 zone, there's a minimum 5-foot setback, or 5 foot, you know, the lot coverage, which we almost seem to know where we're going on that. I think we almost pulled enough info together that we can say in the MDR2 zone, we think it should be increased, and what that final number is, we probably got enough to do that. So
doesn't the sliding scale affect this particular, or the property that got us here?
The wording says the smaller, the larger, I'm sorry, it says the larger. Where you look at the wording in that sends you back to the table, it says the larger of the two, because the the coverage is mixed in with the setbacks, the side and front setbacks. So the wording is wrong. We need to change that. We need to make the scale a multiplier. So there's a couple of things wrong there. So I think we need to definitely work on the prescriptive table and then move to that.
Can I share my screen for just 1 second? Do
Sure.
you have to give me permission, or do I just go share screen?
Just do it.
You have permission.
Um,
The power.
So this is from a document that I did for a neighborhood in Springfield. It's Glenbrook Springdale, which is in Stamford. And I won't go into all the stuff that's in this document. I'll just show you what I'm talking about. What we did was we took a photograph of a building that everybody liked. We drew over it in pencil to make it a little bit more abstract. And then we listed over here the things that were the characteristics of that building that made it acceptable. And then we had photographs of things that were not acceptable and photographs of things that were. And then we did the same thing for a typical downtown building. Everybody had a picture of something that they liked. I drew over it by hand to make it a little bit more abstract. And then we just annotated it with like, what is it about this? And it's not like this takes it out of the world of arguments. You're still going to have a lot of arguments, but at least you have something like a starting place for what it is you're looking for from the next proposal. And this is not a huge lift. This is, this is a couple of hours of sketching by hand over one of Steve's photographs, and then annotating it and stapling 5 or 6 of these things together and calling it the Palisade Suite Design Guideline or Design Character Guidelines. And then I don't know what the legalities are of like, whether it has to be legally adopted by the planning board or I don't know about that, but we would have, something like this is not that big a lift and could go a long way, I think, to putting some parameters around what it is we're talking about.
That's great, Rob. I will add that if you see, let's say, a porch or some element that is repeat itself in some form of fashion and creates a character to the street, that also has to be identified.
Right.
It's not only one facade, it's
right.
Or setbacks or gardens or courtyards. I remember we were discussing the inner, the rear yard, that there were a bunch of structures that they were creating some character. There are things that will be interesting to be studied and documented.
I agree.
Yeah.
Well, the challenge on that street is that the buildings are so diverse in terms of their appearance that it's hard to find some sort of commonality among them, which is what makes it interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, I think, but somehow, I think some of those pictures that Steve, look, it's true that they're all different in some ways, but it does sort of hang together somehow. And trying to articulate what that is worth a little bit of effort. So
19th century scale.
But yeah, I remember I did this study on East Jerusalem, and there were very dissimilar buildings, but we studied and we found very interesting pattern that then put everything together. It's a kind of tight entire street, but that pattern is what gave character to what we were all trying to understand.
You might try to integrate some greenscape in as well.
Of course.
There are parts of that street that are very green. And, the stretch just south of the project we're talking about, is devoid of greenery. And some attempt should be made to retain that or include that in any project.
Yes.
That's the impervious coverage aspect.
Of course.
But Ed, back to the zone. So we're not at a point where we could say, we're going to recommend these 3 zone changes for the whole thing, just to be simple-minded about it for a minute, that the maximum coverage be 32%, that the side yard setbacks be reduced to 5 feet on one side or the other. And what else? We had one other thing. I didn't like the parking being so, but I guess there's quite a bit of disagreement about it. I think a lot of these, if you didn't have all the parking across the street, I would agree with what Laura was saying, but I got this huge parking lot and nobody's in there. And I think it's just crazy to jam parking in on this. Anyway, so that's just me.
Well, we're not going to change the parking in the code. You know, that's a waiver. So what we are going to, what we have, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, is asked Rob to ask his guy to look at the east side of A, and Alan asked to work out the 75 percentile average.
Okay.
So that we'll come back and we'll look at that for the coverage. The front setback is not a problem. The rear setback should definitely stay the same. If you wanted to make one side 5-foot setback, that wouldn't be crazy, but one side should have to stay 10 because we want to enable and be able to make them have a driveway.
Yes.
So we can't have 5 foot on both sides.
Is there fire? Do they have to have, like, how do you get, if there's a fire? I'm not talking about this property now. I'm just talking about along one of these blocks. I guess the firemen just have to kind of go through the building or go around.
Usually, you know, in a normal fire, they fight internally. They drag a hose in the front door and go up to where the fire is. When it's so out of control, they put the ladder up and they put a big hose off the top of the ladder and start drowning the building from far away. So, you know, it's not like they're going to run down the side of the building with a hose. Sometimes they may run down the side of the building with a ladder to get somebody out at an emergency escape opening. You know, that's why you should have that 5 foot.
I just want to add to what Laura was talking about. When I was photographing down there, every person I talked to complained about the parking. You know, unless the city is going to give away that empty lot, you know, people get home from work, they have no place to park and they are on a schedule, you know, and it's, and also it was mentioned that people who, I mean, maybe it's not so true now, but people who do take the train sometimes park on that street and walk down. And so they occupy the space that the residents can't
There's
There-
a residential permit thing. They can't do that anymore.
Well, they were, it was not being enforced is what they were complaining about.
Okay, but because, you know, there are management things you can do too. There may be that there are ways in which it's being managed that could be different, like what is the really steep street where they added going down to the station where they made it resident only, you know, limited.
Oh, yeah.
Walnut?
Yeah.
Well,
But I just
Yeah.
want to mention that you know, the residents who live there really need to park their cars someplace.
right. And the thing is also, you know, the fact that that lot exists now, who knows in 10 years, and I keep saying this, and I'm sorry I dwell on it, but I've been here 20 years and I see an influx of problems with parking. And even though we have that empty lot now, who's going to say in 10 years that lot is not going to be a huge asset to this community? And to have our residents parking there when we could possibly have people that are coming here to go to restaurants and stuff parking there. So, you know, I don't think that it's something that we should just be like, oh, okay, we'll just have our residents park there. No, that's not an issue. I mean, that's not something that we should bank on, because it's probably in the future not a good source for people to count on to park there. You know, I think our village needs to be able to have that asset for the that are like restaurants or whatever. And maybe they're not using it now because maybe they don't know about it. But I think in the future, I don't know. I just don't feel like it's the right thing to do. So
Well, I don't know. I don't agree. And I guess but
we'll always not agree.
yeah,
You have a
but
different
yeah,
vision.
it's a different
Now,
issue. And I think that hopefully one of the things that we wanted, I mean, there is a way to answer that question though, which is for somebody to do a kind of what they think is a reasonable build out of the downtown and estimate what they think the parking demand is likely to be in 10 years. I don't think
There's the theater issue and things like that too.
yeah.
I have to say, like, and I know I keep repeating myself, but I live here and I've been in my building at 191 Broadway for now I'm going on my 11th year, and I do not leave my house. Once I find parking, I don't leave because I know I cannot find parking when I get back. So it's an issue, you know, like people that have drive come home, that's great, but I don't, you know. And
I'll just say this, because then I think I can say that this is, whatever the perception is of Dobbs Ferry of the parking is something we should try to get our handle on. But I can tell you this from my experience. There is no downtown success story that I know of that started with, we're going to solve our parking problem. I'm just telling you that. You show me a place that doesn't have a parking problem, and I'll show you a place that is
Has no life.
is dead. You start with what kind of place do we want in terms of a whole bunch of parameters. Ease of parking may be one of them. Affordable housing is another one. Our need to be responsible about the fact that we have a train station is another one. And there has to be a community-wide discussion about how those things are going to be prioritized. But you're not going to revitalize. The reason downtown Dobbs Ferry is hurting is not because there isn't enough parking.
Do we all agree that we're going to have one zone with common requirements and so on? Because you can make an argument that things are different on different sides of the street or different ends of the street, but it would sure be simpler if we could do it in one piece.
I think we could, if we set up character guidelines or whatever we call them for those 3 distinct areas, I think that should, in the vision plan, that should be enough.
I would almost argue you want to add a fourth. The west side of the section A is quite different than the east side.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that maybe should be broken into 2 areas.
Yeah. No, it's really a question of the numbers, not just what it looks like, but the number, the side yard and depth and everything, height and everything else. So.
But I think we could deal with it with these characteristic guidelines.
I agree for what it's worth. I think the zoning with the character guidelines for the areas that need it, the zoning changes can be modest, and the character guidelines can be the element that makes us take that area seriously with enough ability to ensure the development adds to and doesn't subtract from a pretty special block. So I think the character guidelines could be limited to that one block, and we could add some other parts if we wanted to. But from my view, you have one special block that requires special treatment, special consideration that we need to articulate. And Rob's showing each building, and it felt more like what was special about it is the collection of buildings. So how to do that as a character guideline issue is something, so that the new development has to fit into a collection more than.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree. That's what Ayer was saying. So I don't know. So is the takeaway from this that Ayer, Steve, and I have volunteered to kind of take a first pass at this character guideline thing?
That'd be fun.
I mean,
thank you, guys.
Knock yourself
Go
for it. Thank you. Thank you.
So we're at 9:09, Chairman. Should we call it a day?
We did well. Yeah. Okay.
It says we're done.
Thank you as always.
Thanks,
everybody.
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 Thanks, everybody.
Stay safe.
Stay well.
Everybody stay safe.
Good night. We'll do this again.
Good night.
Have a good
Bye.
night, guys.
And thank you.
Credits, Jen.
Good night.